All right, buckle up because this is one of those stories that still haunts me whenever I'm alone at night. And believe me, after everything that happened, I won't touch a Ouija board again. I wasn't a believer at first. I mean, it was all just stories, right? But a friend, let's call him Sam, he swore there was something real about those boards. And on a night I was house-sitting alone in this creepy old place on the edge of town, I decided, against my better judgment, to give it a go. I found the board in a dusty attic, stuffed in a box labeled old stuff. Figured it was all part of the thrill, you know? So I lit a couple of candles, set the board down, and put my fingertips on the planchette. The silence was thick, and in that moment, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting. I whispered, "Is there anyone here?" Nothing. I thought, of course not, and was about to pack it up when the planchette slid to yes. I froze. Convinced I must have moved it somehow, I took my hands off, let out a nervous laugh, and shook it off. But curiosity got the best of me, and I placed my fingers back on. "What's your name?" I asked, feeling silly. It spelled out slowly and deliberately, Michael. I knew no one named Michael. And the planchette didn't move after that, just sat still like it was waiting. I could have left it there, packed it up, and called it a weird fluke. But I asked another question. "Were you human?" Again, it crept over to yes. The candles flickered, casting shadows that seemed to grow and twist, and I started to feel the walls closing in. My skin prickled, and it was getting hard to breathe, but the question slipped out before I could stop myself. "Do you want something?" The planchette skidded to yes so hard, I thought I was about to pass out. A cold breeze cut through the room, enough to blow out one of the candles. I glanced at the empty spot next to me on the floor, a spot that suddenly seemed like it wasn't empty at all. But the worst was yet to come. I wanted to pack it up, forget the whole thing, but something wouldn't let me. It felt like my hands were glued to the planchette, even as fear clawed up my spine. I swallowed hard and forced myself to ask, What do you want?" The planchette started moving fast, faster than it had before, like Michael was trying to get something urgent across. "Time." "Time?" I whispered, my voice barely a breath. "What do you mean?" No answer, just silence, so thick you could hear it. And then I heard something I'll never forget, a soft, rhythmic ticking. It was faint, but unmistakable. It sounded like a clock, somewhere deep within the house. I had never seen any clocks in that place. The ticking grew louder, closer, as if something was counting down, but I couldn't tell to what. My hands were cold and clammy as I gripped the planchette, but I couldn't let go. "What happens when the time runs out?" I asked, half hoping for silence, half dreading an answer. And that's when it spelled out something that made my blood run cold. "YOU." I tried to get up, but the ticking was so loud now it was pounding in my head. I could feel it vibrating under my skin, in my bones. I forced myself to stand and started moving backward, away from the board, away from whatever was happening in that room. But the air was thick, pressing down on me, like something invisible was forcing me to stay put. Then suddenly, it stopped. The ticking, the pressure, all of it. Just silence. I stumbled back, breathing hard, and then I noticed I wasn't alone. In the candlelight, I saw a shadow, a figure standing just a few feet away from me. I couldn't see its face, but I felt its eyes. They were locked onto mine with this terrible, unyielding hunger. It took a step forward, and I realized it wasn't just any shadow. It was a man with dark, hollow eyes, and a thin, twisted smile that grew wider as he stepped closer. I felt the air around me grow colder, almost freezing. "Michael?" I managed to choke out, my voice cracking. The figure grinned, and his head tilted in a way that was both unnatural and horrifying, as if his neck couldn't fully support it. In a low, gravelly voice that didn't quite match the mouth that moved, he whispered, "Time's up." My chest tightened. I couldn't breathe, couldn't scream. But before he could take another step, I remembered the one thing I'd read about Ouija boards: always say goodbye. With the last bit of strength I had, I threw myself at the board, slamming my hand down on the planchette and dragging it to goodbye. I didn't know if it would work, but as soon as I did it, the room seemed to exhale. The shadow stopped, the cold receded, and the figure slowly melted back into the darkness. I sat there in silence, clutching my chest, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I glanced down at the board, and the planchette had moved, on its own, back to the center. The next day, I packed up my things and left that house, leaving the board exactly where I found it. But sometimes, late at night, I swear I can still hear it. That faint ticking, somewhere in the back of my mind. I was around 20 when I first stumbled into the dark obsession that nearly devoured me. It began when a group of friends and I gathered around a Ouija board. Cliché, right? Just a bunch of college students trying to entertain themselves during a thunderstorm. But the thing is, this was no regular Ouija board. It was one that had been passed down from my friend's grandmother. An old, fragile thing with faded letters and symbols that made me uneasy the second I saw it. The air in the room changed as soon as we set our fingers on the planchette. That sticky, heavy feeling, like something in the air had turned dense, thick enough to choke you if you breathed in too deeply. But we all laughed it off, like idiots. "What's your name?" my friend asked, his voice a mix of mockery and thrill. The planchette jerked under our fingers, spelling out something that didn't make sense at first. "Zarath," it spelled out. We looked at each other, nervous laughter fading. I wasn't going to be the first to admit I was scared, but my fingers trembled as we continued. We asked what it wanted. The planchette slowly moved, circling the board like it was taunting us, and finally rested on the word, life. "Do you want one of us?" I whispered. That's when the lights flickered, plunging us into momentary darkness. I thought it was just the storm, but the planchette moved again, faster this time, dragging our fingers along with it, spelling out HIM, before shooting toward my friend's name written on the corner of his notebook. Everyone laughed nervously, but I could see it in their eyes. We weren't fooling anyone. We were scared. I still remember the look on my friend's face when the lights came back on. He looked empty. His skin was pale, eyes wide, unblinking. "It's just a game," he muttered. But his voice sounded strange, hollow, like it wasn't coming from him at all. We decided to end the session there, but something was off. My friend looked sick, his face gray and sweaty, yet his expression didn't change. It was like he wasn't fully there, like he'd left some part of himself behind when the lights had flickered. We all pretended it was fine, that the session had been just some dumb scare, but deep down, we all knew better. A few days passed, and we stopped hearing from him. Messages went unanswered. Calls went straight to voicemail. So I went to check on him. When I arrived, his place was dark, the curtains drawn tight, and a rotting smell seeped out from under the door. My stomach turned, but I knocked, calling his name. Silence. Then slowly, the door creaked open. He was standing there, staring at me, his eyes sunken, ringed in dark shadows. He looked at me with a blank, dead gaze, and when he finally spoke, his voice was a low, guttural whisper that barely sounded human. I didn't know it would follow me back. He let me in, and as soon as I stepped inside, that same thick, choking air wrapped around me. It was like being underwater, heavy and pressing, the silence so loud it felt alive. I could see that he'd covered every mirror in his apartment with sheets, even taped over his TV screen. I asked him why. "It's the eyes," he muttered, almost to himself. "It watches through the eyes." I laughed nervously, hoping he'd snap out of it, but he only stared back with a haunted emptiness that made my skin crawl. He led me into his living room where the Ouija board sat on his coffee table, open like it was waiting for us. I told him he should get rid of it, burn it, do something, but he just shook his head. "It's not the board anymore. It's something else. I can feel it, crawling around, waiting, watching." I tried to convince him to leave, to get out of the apartment, but he refused. Said it wouldn't matter, that whatever we'd contacted during that session had attached itself to him. "It likes the fear," he whispered, "and it's hungry." That night, I stayed over, hoping to keep him company, make sure he didn't do anything rash. We barely slept. Every time I'd drift off, I'd wake to see him standing by the window, staring out into the darkness, and then, in the silence, I heard it, scratching, faint and persistent, coming from somewhere deep within the walls. He didn't seem surprised. "The board was just the invitation," he murmured. "It needed a doorway, and we opened it. Now, it's here." As dawn broke, I left, desperate to get away from that suffocating air, that oppressive darkness that seemed to linger around him. I tried calling him the next day. No answer. I went back to his apartment, but it was empty. I asked his neighbors, and they told me they hadn't seen him, that he'd just vanished. But the story didn't end there. A few nights later, I was lying in bed, trying to shake the whole experience. I was half asleep when I heard it, that familiar faint scratching. I bolted upright, heart pounding, and saw nothing. Just shadows. I brushed it off as a lingering paranoia, but when I lay back down, my phone buzzed. It was a message from him. One word: hungry. I tried calling back, but there was no response. Just silence. Then from somewhere in the quiet of my own room, I heard it, a low guttural whisper that felt like it was coming from right beside me. It was my friend's voice, or something pretending to be him. "Don't look in the mirror." It all started the night I found an old Ouija board in my basement, buried under a heap of dusty boxes that had probably been untouched for decades. I was alone in the house. My friends had dared me to try it out, laughing about it over text, saying, "No way you're brave enough to actually try it." So, I guess pride got the better of me. With a smirk and a glass of whiskey by my side, I set the board on my coffee table, lit a couple of candles, and decided to see what the fuss was all about. The planchette felt colder than I expected as I set my fingers on it. The letters on the board seemed faded, but the word "goodbye" was oddly pristine, as if it had been painted on yesterday. "Is anyone here with me?" I asked, half joking, feeling a bit foolish. At first, nothing happened. Just silence, thick and oppressive, as though the air around me had suddenly gotten denser. But then, it began to move. Not slowly, not with a gradual glide, but with a sharp, calculated jolt. It was like someone was impatiently yanking it across the board. Yes. A chill ran down my spine, and I pulled my hand away instinctively, my mind racing. But then, curiosity, or maybe a twisted sense of adventure, took over, and I placed my fingers back on the planchette. "Who were you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The planchette slid, faster this time, spelling out TRAP. I was stunned, unsure if this was a prank or if my imagination was just getting the best of me. But before I could process what was happening, the lights flickered and a low, guttural sound, like a distant hum, filled the room. I sat there, frozen, feeling a prickling at the back of my neck. The hum grew louder, taking on a rhythm, a cadence that felt wrong, like something imitating human speech, but not quite getting it right. The planchette jerked again, dragging my hand along with it, spelling out a single word, RUN. I barely had time to process it before the room plunged into darkness. My phone's screen, sitting on the table, suddenly flared to life, casting an eerie blue glow across the room. Every other electronic device in the house was dead, but my phone started playing a video by itself. Shaky footage, as though someone were running, the camera bobbing up and down, its frame capturing the front of my own house, my door, my windows. Someone was filming the outside of my house in real time. My stomach twisted as I scrambled to shut it off, but the video kept playing. The camera turned, and I saw something impossible. A figure, barely visible, with hollow eyes and a wide, unnatural grin, lurking just outside my door. It stood motionless, staring directly into the camera, directly at me. I jumped up, breathing hard, clutching my phone. The board lay there, silent but menacing, the planchette fixed over RUN. Every instinct screamed at me to get out, but some twisted part of me needed to know, needed to finish. I whispered, barely louder than a breath, "What do you want?" And the planchette, without me touching it this time, slid slowly, laboriously, spelling out YOU. The door to my basement slammed open, and I felt a rush of icy air crawl up my spine. Shadows seemed to bleed out from the doorway, twisting and curling like tendrils, stretching toward me. I stumbled back, reaching for the light switch, but nothing happened. The candles flickered violently, casting elongated shadows that danced across the walls. Then, that same guttural hum filled the air again, growing louder, pressing in on me. It was coming from the basement, a noise that somehow seemed both distant and uncomfortably close. And worse, I could hear footsteps, slow and heavy, trudging up the basement stairs. Every fiber of my being told me to leave, to get out, but my legs felt like lead. As the footsteps drew closer, I could see something in the darkness of the basement doorway, an outline, tall and gaunt, with eyes that gleamed unnaturally in the candlelight. With a final surge of terror-fueled strength, I forced myself to move. I stumbled backward, eyes locked on the figure emerging from the basement. Its smile was wide and wrong, stretching too far across its face, as if the skin had been pulled tight over a skull that didn't quite fit. I didn't look back. I ran, bolting through my front door and into the cold night air. But as I reached the street, I turned back. The figure was there, standing in my doorway, watching, still grinning. I never went back to that house. I left everything, furniture, clothes, even my car keys. But sometimes, late at night, my phone buzzes. I'll pick it up, hands shaking, to find an image waiting for me, a blurry, dark picture of my own doorway, taken from outside, with that same impossible figure, standing in the shadows, watching. And every time the message below reads the same, RUN.